African countries are rising up to the colonizer France. One by one, they're realizing that they were taken advantage of. But how did France do that? Well, one of the ways was through what's called the CFA franc, the monetary note, which is nothing short than a country being pillaged. Hi, I'm Kavatahwe. Welcome to Economic Divide. Coming up in this program, some of the highlights: the CFA franc, the French way of controlling the monetary system in the countries being colonized, but it undermined democracy and the economy. However, it ensured French colonialism. Next, we take a look at France's agenda as another one of the highlights, in which African underdevelopment was one of the purposes of France vis-a-vis the respective countries. Also, forcing reliance on raw material exports. And another method was a monopoly on exports and imports, all to the advantage of France. And then the relationship between France and African leaders, complicit in choosing leaders, and also French and U.S. control was broken. How did that happen? You had the recent coups, which were a form of pushback. Africa is going through a political turmoil. Just weeks ago, Gabon witnessed a coup. It was the second former French colony in Africa to face a military coup in as many months, and the sixth in 3 years, following Mali, Chad, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and most recently, Niger.
Là, c'est l'indépendance. L'armée a libéré le pays. Nous sommes libres. Nous avons le droit d'être libres et de nous exprimer comme on veut. Parce que nous ne savons pas qu'on peut être libérés. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes libres.
Anti-French sentiment is running high across those nations. That is due to France's dark colonial past and its neo-colonial footprints there. One of those elements is the CFA franc zone, created by France in 1945. The CFA franc was meant to control the cost of access to raw materials from the colonies and to shield France's corner from the other monetary bloc controlled by the UK, the sterling area. CFA franc remains to this day the currency in place in 14 African countries. Regardless of their independence from France decades ago, the currency is controlled by the French treasury. In practice, African countries channel more money to France than they receive in aid and have no sovereignty over their monetary policies. The currency is referred to as a tool of monetary servitude, the invisible tool of France-Afrique, or, in plain terms, the colonial currency. The pact between France and its former colonies was designed to ensure the deliberate underdevelopment of African nations at the expense of France.
Pour avoir 500, avoir 1000 francs, je suis obligé de venir dire ces 500 sous le soleil, au zénith. Hein, vous voyez que c'est pas vraiment bien. On veut de très bonnes conditions de vie.
It's time now for our media post for this program. First up, the pros and cons of the CFA franc zone. This article went on to say the main features of the franc zone are the fixed exchange rate, formerly with the French franc, now with the euro. It went on to say membership of the franc zone implies a sharing of sovereignty with France and with the other members of the monetary union. Next up, we took a look at this viewer comment on the matter, where it said, by the name of Is It Real, said the $2 billion in assistance to Niger is actually a loan from the World Bank to be repaid with interest. France knows how to twist the truth to make it sound like welfare. France helping fight terrorists is just an excuse to keep French troops on the ground in Niger to secure their corporate interest. It is not in their best interest to actually drive out the terrorists. All right, next we go to a website. It asks how France continues to dominate its former colonies in Africa. It said in France's former African colonies, imperialist monetary policies from Paris continue to cripple domestic economies and undermine democracy. Then it said colonialism in Africa won't have meaningfully come to an end until true economic sovereignty is allowed to flourish. And finally, we go to another viewer comment by the name of Lee to Lee. It said Niger is not a state in America or Europe, it is in Africa. The people are very poor, while the country is very rich in natural resources. There is no electricity. The uranium generates electricity in France and Europe for their industries and families. They don't care about Niger. Get rid of them, Niger. They are like parasites, draining your body from blood. All the troops must get out of Niger now. Ouch, that's pretty harsh when it comes to the role that France plays in Niger. All right, it's time for our first Q&A. Let me introduce our guest. We have Dr. Charles Sinkala. He is a senior researcher in governance for Member of Parliament and also a presidential candidate in the 2021 Zambian elections. Dr. Sinkala, welcome to Economic Divide. So taking a look at the CFA franc and the role that that has played, and of course the way that France executed this monetary system. You have the banks from Africa that deposited the money into the French treasury, and of course that's a large portion of the foreign currency, which they couldn't even use as collateral, amongst other things. Can you tell us more about what some have described to be the violation of a country's sovereignty when it comes to France and its use of the CFA franc in Central or in Western and Central Africa?
Thank you very much. And I think we must understand the basic of the background of the Francophone countries. The 14 odd countries were purchased in what we call the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885, what we call the auction of Africa, where France purchased these territories, and they have owned the territories in terms of the central banks, and they own, whatever minerals or whatever that income comes from those countries.
All right, thank you for that. Let me introduce our next guest now. Kwame Gonza joins us. Kwame Gonza is a director of operations at Connect Africa. Kwame Gonza, welcome to Economic Divide. The relationship between France and these African countries is really incredible. I mean, I'm looking at, for example, how it also involved, on purpose, keeping these countries underdeveloped. I'd like to find out from you if that's the case, and that would be obviously to France's advantage. For example, forcing reliance on raw material exports, and also how the French monopolized things like shipping, exports, and imports. And this system of the CFA franc was designed by France to ensure that French colonialism actually prevailed. If that's true, then why did these countries allow this to happen?
Yeah, so there was a combination of tools that France has used. When these countries emerged from independence, a lot of them were impoverished. And you remember they created the Bretton Woods institutions. And the Bretton Woods institutions were presented as institutions which were coming to help the reconstruction of the poor countries that were emerging out of colonialism. They used a combination of tools to be able to put back these countries to the place of subjugation, and that is the IMF and World Bank. If you look at Africa in the 1970s, Africa had a share of global manufacturing of up to 7%.
Time now for the InfoNews section of the program. First up, we took a look at U.S. poverty that has been in the news recently. The reason being that it has jumped for the year 2022 based on the records that came out. And what's alarming is that child poverty more than doubled, and that's the first increase in 13 years for that country. Some of the reasons: the expiration of pandemic programs, which are refundable tax credits and stimulus payments, were, I guess, a contributing factor in that case. Our take on that: the 2021 child tax credit expansion as part of President Joe Biden's $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan provided parents between $250 to $300 a month per child. Also in April 2023, the most recent month with available figures, 41.9 million people in 22.2 million households received SNAP benefits. SNAP is a program for people who don't have enough money for food, basically, and they need assistance with food. and that translates to 12.5% of the total U.S. population. Unbelievable. All right, next up, we go from the U.S. over to Europe and the Eurozone in particular, where we take a look at the economy there. Eurozone money supply has shrunk, and this, for the first time in 13 years, signals economic downturn for that zone. Europe as a whole is sliding into a recession as the August PMI numbers all turned negative. So the Eurozone is not doing well. Europe as a whole, in terms of its respective countries, also not showing good signs and economic indicators. Next up, we went to a meeting by the name of G20, not by the name, a group of G20 that held this meeting over in New Delhi in India. There was a joint statement that was issued and included climate financing, global debt, the reform of institutions like the World Bank, and also a new Green Development Pact. No action plan, however, on global debt, the cost of living crisis, including inflation and the world energy shortages. Obviously, we had to go in and put our analysis into this. The G20 started back in the year 1999 in the wake of the Asian financial crisis, meant as a forum for finance ministers and central bank governors to discuss global finance and economic issues. Now, fast forward to 2023, the global economy is besieged by soaring inflation, mounting debt, and is fueled by climate emergency. So we ask, what good is the G20 if they're the 20 top economies of the world and they're not solving problems that, in a sense, are repeating themselves year in and year out? All right, those were the news that we picked for our Info News section. Any suggestions that you may have that's more important for us, do send them to us. Contact information is coming up. Time now for the in-depth section of the program. France's control of its colonies was not something that happened recently. It has been going on for quite some time, decades really, but its monetary control through the CFA franc showed the true colors of a colonizer. That is what we'll be looking at in this in-depth section. So let's get going. Well, it was the year 1800, in terms of the date, where France forced an official exchange rate with the French currency. Paris sought to monopolize these circuits of production. Even French armed troops were sent to markets. They forced merchants to actually accept the French currency. And in turn, trade taxes were demanded in francs. So just one of the ways, and that's the outline that you see over here. Next, let's go and take a look at the countries that France had colonized. Obviously, we want to see what they were. As you can see over here, it's broken up into West Africa and Central Africa. And some of the countries that you see here, Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau. We have the Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Togo, and the Central African Republic. The count is 14 countries in all, and that happened during the date of 1930s, where those 14 countries came under the control of France in terms of colonizing it. Now let's move on to the next one. Enforcing colonialism, how do they went about it? Well, in the 1930s onwards, France dominated the money supply. And these were some of the perks. For example, it used African labor and then access to raw materials at sub-market prices. Those were just now a couple of examples. And then what it would do, France would actually sell the finished goods that it used in those two examples back to Africa at above market prices. And this is what's called franc Afrique there at the bottom. Yes, that's how France, as a colonizer, took advantage of Africa. Next up, let's go to the year 1945. You have the birth of the CFA franc. That's when that happened. It created those two currencies, the Central African CFA franc, and then that would be this banknote, for example, from Senegal. And then you had the other, which is the one from Congo, which is the one that you see over there. So these are the two different currencies that it actually created. In essence, it controlled the monetary sovereignty of 14 nations. These 14 nations made up nearly 200 million people. All right? Now, let's look at the way that they controlled these countries in terms of the money distribution. Now, member states deposited half of their exchange rate, as you can see over there. It went to the French treasury. These are the exchange reserves. Additionally, you had another 20% that was deposited for financial liabilities, as it's called. This meant that member states had access only to 30% of their money. So obviously that doesn't sound like a fair shake at all, especially when you have to deposit that much of your money and you don't have access to it. So that's another way that France exercised its CFA franc monopoly. When all that's said and done, France had a very cozy setup. It had 14 African countries set up to provide it with the raw materials, as we discovered, at rock bottom prices, manpower, low wages, to help it with its manufacturing. And then on top of all that, it had these countries deposit their money at a central bank, which then France turned around and generated revenues from that. You couldn't have a better setup than that. All right, let me now bring in Mahdi. He joins us to tell us what's coming up in his section. Mahdi, did we leave anything out from how France controlled its colonies?
Hi, Kaveh. There are many other ways that France is making money off its former colonies, and these methods are short of stealing money, like what France does with the CFA franc money in the French treasury. I will cover that at length in the Quick Take section.
All right, thank you for that. We'll find out more from Mahdi, obviously, in his section. Now let me bring back our guest for our Q&A here. We have Dr. Charles Sinkala rejoining us, economic and senior researcher in governance for a member of parliament. Dr. Sinkala, welcome back to Economic Divide. So I'm looking at France and how it used its relationships with these countries of its former colonies, that is. But in the aspect of the leaders that were chosen to be in power, there was obviously a relationship that benefited both. But we're looking at how there are coups that have happened recently, one after another. Gabon, Niger, the Ivory Coast also. Now, the French grip appears to have been broken. I mean, why do you think these countries are rising up at this particular time?
Yes, Cameroon, Burkina Faso, Mali, Cameroon and Eritrea, most of those nations has been infested by coup d'etats. You know, what happens in the African continent, it's a short of money, they're short of currency, they're short of resources in terms of the currency that they have dominated the United States of dollars. And, you know, governments are installed by those who have interest that the United States of America, France, Russia, they've got companies which have got a military complex where they contract their military mechanism. The part of the military budget, I think it is an average of $460 million budget to guarantee them that there won't be coup d'etats. But these are the ones who actually perpetrate and install presidents.
All right, thank you for that. Let me bring back now Kwame Gonza, Director of Operations at Connect Africa, who rejoins us. Kwame Gonza, welcome back to Economic Divide. It's very interesting how we're looking at the respective countries recently, such as Niger, such as now Gabon, and then we're looking also at the Ivory Coast, where the governments there, the people basically don't want it, and you have a transition taking place, whether it's to a military transitional government or otherwise. But people have realized that the resources of the countries is not working to their benefit. France obviously had a relationship with the heads of state, which benefited both, but not the people. Give us your take as to why we're looking at things happening at the rate they are at this juncture in time.
Yeah, so I think the financial success is dependent on whether the government represents the current which takes over after the one which represents the neo-colonial interests or the colonial interests, represents the people. So that is where that kind of success will come from, a government which cares for the people. We have seen that in places like Burkina Faso, for example. We have seen that in Niger and Mali so far. In Gabon, we are not sure. So these coups are not the same in many cases. When colonialism was abolished, various territories remained divided. And so they remained vulnerable to that manipulation from outside. And this is what our forefathers were trying to fight against when they talked about unification, so that we can be able to.
Across the France-Afrique spectrum, France still today controls the currency, foreign reserves, the comprador elites, and trade businesses. France de facto controls the overwhelming majority of infrastructure in Francophone Africa. It is a virtual monopoly. Multiple French giants are operating in Africa, like the French conglomerate Bolloré's control of port and marine transport throughout West Africa. Then there's Bouygues Vinci, which dominates construction and public works, water and electricity distribution. Total has huge stakes in oil and gas. And then there's France's big banking, Société Générale, Crédit Lyonnais, BNP Paribas, to name a few. France has for decades made sure that there's very little intra-Africa trade. There have been attempts by African leaders to get rid of French control. Back in 2019, it was announced that the West African currency would be reformed and replaced by an independent currency to be called ECO. However, ECO would still be pegged to the euro and the burden that it implies.
Neocolonialism is on the move. Look at what the UK and Germany have done in Africa. But let me tell you, France has to be held accountable the most for what's happening in some African countries. Europe must act now to give back to Africa a prominent role.
The project is, however, yet to materialize. The growing unpopularity of France in Africa and the younger generation's rejection of its presence are no accidents. There cannot be a French-American solution to Africa's challenges.
Hello and welcome to the Quick Take section. I'm Mahdi Aposian. We want to take a look at the other ways France makes money off its former colonies. One of the ways is through the exchange rate from the CFA franc to the euros. Initially, the CFA franc was pegged to its French counterpart at a rate of 1.7 to 1, but in 1948 it was increased to 2 to 1 by overvaluing the CFA franc. Paris maintained its economic advantage while crushing Africa's export competitiveness. The transfer of the money to the French treasury is another way that the French government makes money off its colonies. Not only can they not use this money as collateral, sometimes they have to pay the French central bank just for keeping it there. We know that the CFA franc denominations are in euros, but when accounts are in credit, the African central banks effectively place their foreign exchange reserves at France's disposal. But when the central bank's accounts are in debit, they are obligated to pay interest to the French treasury. In other words, CFA member states pay France to hold on to their money. There is then the question of what France does with the money that is deposited in the French treasury. There are two very realistic things that France can do. With that money, pay off a portion of its debt or invest that money at a profit. The total amount deposited by the CFA zone treasuries is around 15 billion euros. That's half of their foreign currency reserves, and it is refundable. With interest rates around 1%, they could produce about 150 million euros at most. There are speculations that this figure could be a lot more. According to this entry by a German newspaper, Africa pays 400 billion euros per year to France, which said the French government collects from its former colonies each year 440 billion euros of taxes. Finally, the exploitation of Africa by France wouldn't be complete if it didn't include two important sectors: natural resources, and then the one not that well known, and that is West African ports. It is no secret how African countries are rich in natural resources like uranium, gold, and oil and gas. Niger provides around 20% of France's uranium needs. Meanwhile, Gabon is a source of crude oil. Mauritania delivers iron ore, while Togo and Benin provide agricultural commodities. And now comes the icing on the cake. French national Vince Boulevard owns most of West Africa's major ports. It is no surprise then that former French President Jacques Chirac had this to say about Africa. We have to be honest and acknowledge that a big part of the money in our banks comes precisely from the exploitation of the African continent. Without Africa, France will slide down into the rank of a third world power. That brings us to the end of this quick take. Don't forget to send us your comments or ideas you would like to be covered in the show. I'm Mahdi Abbasian, and I'll see you next week.
Mali, Niger, Gabon, Burkina Faso, the countries continue to topple the Western aligned governments opting for new rulers, which, after the transition period, well, they're going to elect a leader that's